Hello, you are tuned to Resilience Radio. I'm Irvin Eisenberg, host of the show and owner of Resilience Occupational Therapy. As always, the opinions on this show are not necessarily my own, but I like to showcase a variety of different perspectives, and none of it is meant to be medically diagnostic or prescriptive in any way. Today is the first episode in a three-part series where I have a panel of excellent healthcare practitioners. Kelly McCracken, who has a master's degree in social work and an additional master's degree in public health. Melanie Meyer, who has a doctorate in naturopathic medicine, as well as a master's degree in public health. And Josh Singer, who is an acupuncturist. It's great to have the three of you on today.
Thank you.
Nice to be here.
It's great to be here.
So in this first part, we're going to be discussing anxiety. Just for a brief outline for the listeners, we'll be breaking this into anxiety now, and then we'll be discussing depression in the next episode, and after that, some stress management. And all of those will overlap to some degree, but I wanted to have it well organized for the listeners to be a more digestible segment. Let's start off with Kelly, and can you define anxiety for us? Just to put you right on the spot.
Right, I'm not at all prepared with my words. I can tell you how I think about anxiety in terms of my work, which is that when worry becomes such a habit that it has a life of its own. And I describe it that way because I think it helps to then think about what the work will be, back away from the anxiety and start to have healthy levels of worry again in life rather than habits of anxiety.
And I guess, Melanie, any additional thoughts to add to that?
Well, I think that's brilliantly put, Kelly, in terms of anxiety. I've always found that anxiety in many cases is actually really hard to define. You kind of nailed the approach I tend to take within my practice when someone comes and describes anxiety. The way that anxiety manifests varies so widely per the individual. So I always see it as a symptom that something feels imbalanced in somebody's life. The key in helping somebody with anxiety, of course, is going to be uniquely identifying the things that are contributing to that sensation that the person is reporting. So I see it very similarly to how Kelly described it so beautifully.
And Josh, I know that we're using Western terminology, and you're coming from an Eastern medicine background, so slate as you will between them.
I'm also a Western-minded guy. Yeah, my experience with anxiety with my patients is like you guys are describing. There's people often describe a sense of anxiety in their bodies. Like we're saying, anxiety manifests in such different ways for each person. But I find a lot of people say it doesn't seem to be about my mind or what I'm thinking. It's just this body response that I have. And they often don't even they're not clear what triggers that body response. And it's still seen as anxiety. You know, the chest pressure, people feel like their body's vibrating. Like they say my blood vessels are vibrating. Somebody told me that the other day. I feel like my blood vessels are vibrating. That was interesting. There's sort of this chest tension, vibration feeling. Some people just feel like they feel tight in their shoulders. And then, of course, there's often this mental part of it as well, where they seem like hyper-focused on their worries. Like Kelly was saying, it becomes like it takes a life of its own. Mentally and physically. It's like this physical response that I just find sort of interesting. And as part of the piece of all this, sometimes the mind doesn't even seem involved. And that's really interesting. From a Chinese medical standpoint, to like share more that perspective, in Chinese medical thinking, we have this term we call shen. I can't remember if I've spoken about it here. Maybe. But, you know, it really relates to this. The shen is related in English thinking, like the mind or the consciousness or the spirit even. or I think about it as attention, like where you're putting your attention, where are you putting your shun? So, for example, in sleep, your shun should be anchored, should be settled, rather than outside yourself. And with anxiety, our shun could be hyper focused on a particular subject or worry. We're sort of going there. So it's anxiety can be considered an unsettled shun presentation. So we have certain points or certain herbs we use to help settle the shun in Chinese medicine.
Something I've been thinking about in terms, a lot of my recent study has been into pain neuroscience. And there's the thing I've been doing is talking about how there is a pain experience and that we have this, in general, we can get good at things. Athletes can get really good at doing a particular activity over and over again. A golfer can get their swing really honed in. It's the neurons that fire together, wire together. And that we have these pain experiences. Every time we have pain, it lights up these at least 9 different portions of the brain, and then they work together for the pain experience. But you can get really good at pain, which is not a good thing, so that you can get really habituated to linking a pain experience to other things. And it's occurring to me that anxiety may be a very similar, it taking a life of its own, and there being other parts of the brain that are physical. Feeling it in your chest or feeling it as a physical sensation is the brain wiring all these different parts together.
Another related way that I often talk about it is in the sort of zones of regulation. And I imagine one piece of paper, like a regular letter-sized piece of paper, folded in thirds. And the middle third is that zone of regulation where you feel, you have ups and downs in mood and physical sensations, but you feel more or less calm, creative, rational. And when you are activated, which is another, I think, term for anxiety, you're in the top third of that folded sheet. And the higher you go in your activation, the more stuck you get there, because it is harder and harder to access the more rational and creative parts of your brain and the settled feeling of your body. The lower third might be when you drop down, you're not activated, you're sort of suppressed. Might describe depression for people. We can get to that in the next episode, but that's sort of, it's sort of a two-dimensional concept, but I find it useful. Sometimes people can kind of have the sense of they got kicked up out of their zone of comfort, their zone of being self-regulating.
One of the things that I always try to tease out when someone comes to me in practice is, in many cases, some folks don't, they're so habituated to feeling this sense of chronic worry, or in the sense of there being something physical, having chronic pain, they're so habituated to it that sometimes it's difficult for them to recognize anxiety in their own bodies, because they are so deeply habituated to it. They're accustomed to that sensation. And I actually recognize that as a human, not as a practitioner for a second. I can recognize that in my own body, because I'm so, I always say I have a high vibration. I'm wired. I've always been sort of that character. And so it's harder for me to get to a setting where I would say I'm in a relaxed place without some intentional effort. So the interesting thing, as a provider, being a naturopath, we don't separate the mind from the body. So I always do want to ensure that I'm looking at the physiology of this individual sitting in front of me, because in many cases, some of the physiological drivers, and this came up when each of you were talking in my head, some of the physiological drivers, these neural pathways are absolutely interconnected. We have interneurons that can sound strange and sometimes confusing when we're having body communication. So I always want to look and see, is there something else going on physically in the body that's kicking this up a notch, right? So taking the vibration, as it were, even higher than what would be typical for this person. So we never divorce the mind from the body in the naturopathic model. And I know each of you well as providers as well, and I know that you're thinking of both, but that to me is a crucial piece when we're addressing someone who either states they have anxiety, or sometimes it's about helping someone to recognize that that state might be present without being condescending, because that's another sort of hot button that people that you have to be mindful about as a provider, because many folks have pretty intense pain syndromes and various physiologic pathologies going on. When doctors can't figure it out, oftentimes the default is it's just your stress, or you must be anxious, etc. So you have to, usually there will be both present, and you just have to be careful how you're communicating about that, so that we can still address the anxiety without maybe blaming the anxiety for something that may actually physically be happening, that is an interconnected circumstance, but not strictly because of an anxious state. Or
Absolutely. And in addition to that, I think it's helpful to remember that at its core, pain and anxiety are there as self-protective measures. When used judiciously, they help you. And it's only when they become a habit that they become, chronic, problematic issues. So there's really nothing shameful about it. It's initially from a place of protection, and I see that as a positive thing. It's an integrated part of how we're supposed to operate.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a really good point. People often say, I feel anxious about flying next week or something. I feel anxious. Oh, that makes sense. That seems there's a good reason for that. Your body is flying up there. It seems reasonable to feel anxious. So you listen to how people describe when they talk about anxious. Is it very situational like this? Or is this become a habituated pattern in their nervous system and in their body mind? And so it's important for us to sort of listen to people talk about their anxiety experience. And like Melanie was saying, like really kind of help them put more attention on it, instead of, when we're like Irvin was saying, becomes habituated to the actual nervous system, like the actual nerve pathways become habituated. But so it can become a background thing, and we need to help people just kind of look at it a little closer. And we're the outside practitioner asking questions, and we're curious about their experience, and we care about them. So it can be the safe place for them to explore it a little bit. And that in itself, I think, can be a helpful part of their process of change.
Yeah. I think I'm in discussing something like anxiety, I want to make sure that I'm not sort of titling anxiety disorder to someone, aside from the fact that it's outside of my scope. I don't want people to own that as a problem for themselves and have it necessarily create more anxiety or distress around it. Well, something I'm curious is, it's been my experience that anxiety can present itself in so many different ways. Each brain is unique. And I think some of you alluded to this before, that certain characteristics one might not have thought of as part of someone's personality, they might not have thought of as symptoms of anxiety, or as actually being anxious in a moment. Can anyone speak to there's sort of the classic narrative of the person of what anxiety presents, but how might anxiety present itself in sort of not atypical, but less sort of stereotypical ways?
We've got a couple. I'll just name off a few, and everybody can pepper in. You see it a lot with folks with chronic functional digestive disorders. For example, someone who doesn't have inflammatory bowel disease or an autoimmune disease of the bowel, someone who might not have a anatomical issue with the GI tract, but certainly has daily issues where they're not having regular, easy to pass formed stools. They might have abdominal discomfort. They might be experiencing nausea. The digestive realm is heavily regulated by the nervous system. So folks with an anxious skew, especially if it's more of a fight or flight type response on a regular basis. The physiology of the fight or flight response is we shut down the GI tract because that's not the priority, right? The priority is make sure the heart's pumping, make sure we're breathing, make sure our muscles have fuel to run from the tiger. So we're going to shunt blood away from the GI tract, and we're going to see, as a result, if that perpetuates, that's fine for the short term. If it perpetuates, you're going to see long-term issues. And I know we've had other podcasts about the gut, but that's one. The other thing, we see it a lot in chronic pain syndromes. Anxiety can manifest because a lot of people will somaticize their anxiety through muscle tension, chronic jaw pain, like I see it a lot in the upper traps and the neck. A lot of circumstances like that where is it exclusively because of anxiety? No, not necessarily. But in many cases, once that anxiety ramps, people will notice that those vulnerabilities in those areas, they're going to feel that tension a lot more deeply. And a lot of times it'll come up as pain before you can even cognitively label that as an anxiety state.
I have a bunch too, in addition. I'll just list off a few, but when Melanie said, fight or flight, freeze, of course, is the other big of the three F's. Freeze is also common in anxiety, which can sometimes look like avoidance. So you might think that someone who doesn't leave the house much is depressed, but they actually might be anxious and trying not to become more anxious by avoiding things. I see that a lot. And another one I want to mention is intrusive thoughts. These are all mental health terms. It's very common for people who are anxious to notice that they are having thoughts that seem very bizarre, to the point of being disturbing. And they come in to me and say, I'm really unwell. I might be having violent fantasies or, thoughts that make them feel like there's something terribly wrong with them, when really it's anxiety throwing very extreme scenarios at them, essentially, of things that they might need to worry about. So it's not really a sign of any kind of like psychotic or irrational thinking, but it's just very extreme anxiety. Often that's a symptom that's a sign of the diagnosis of OCD. You don't have to have that diagnosis to have intrusive thoughts. And that's something that I've seen a lot where people find that confusing and distressing.
Kelly, that's super helpful that you described that, because I think a lot of people, and I find this, as a provider, we hear a lot of people's innermost fears, and a lot of people are really, really afraid to acknowledge that those types of intrusive thoughts are in their brains. They're really afraid to say that out loud. And I think destigmatizing those things is really helpful, because we can work with them. People can be present with themselves when those are happening in a different way if they're able to identify them and bring them to light.
Yes.
There's another one I could add, just seems sort of really common and commingled, is a sleep disorder in some way. Anxiety and sleep trouble just really seem to go hand in hand. Yeah, a lot of people just really describe their thinking patterns as they're quiet and not distracted, and they're laying in bed and they're describing these thoughts they have, which could feel often feels out of their control, like we're saying. But that just seems like another big piece. Yeah, I'll add that one.
And then sleep avoidance becomes a behavior pattern in order to not have that experience of lying there with an active brain.
Yeah, it's really
So it
interesting.
seems like,
Yeah, go on, Irvin.
oh, you go ahead.
I was just kind of expressing my interest about this sort of habitual patterns that our bodies can create, or our selves can create. How we get really habituated into ways, or maybe we adapt. That's the human strength as we adapt to conditions. So part of adaptation to like something that may be uncomfortable, we get into habitual patterns. That's just kind of interesting. And for us, how do we help change that pattern and change the habit? I often think that's what we're trying to do. Each of us as practitioners are trying to change some habituated pattern, whether it's in the mind or the body, the nervous system, or the gut, or wherever it is. Just sort of interesting.
That's exactly what I always hope to do. Is I think, how do we, when I'm working with somebody, we look at what things are not serving this individual well, and I find that you can have significant breakthroughs when you give somebody a small reprieve. So somebody, for example, who hasn't slept well for years because of their anxiety and their sort of overactive mind, if you give them, a couple of weeks of good sleep and you can break a pattern, sometimes that's enough to allow the healing that they've become stuck because they're so habituated to whatever pattern. And giving somebody a relief from their constipation, another thing that we see a lot with folks that have a lot of stress or anxiety. You make one small change that is sort of a pattern disruptor, and then you can see great transformation for people.
Absolutely. I agree with that. And that can look so many different ways. Sometimes it can be, I need to tell someone something that I need to get off my chest, or I've been keeping from them, or whatever. It can be something, an action they can take actually can bring a lot of relief too. So I really like that. And it can be described in a lot of different ways. Yeah.
I'm thinking about how we've talked a little bit about like that anxiety is a state that we all have. Anxiety is an adaptive feature we have to deal with stresses and to keeps our, if we weren't afraid of anything, we or weren't anxious about anything, we'd probably have a lot of poor decision making. But it can get out of hand, like any habit, and it seems like it's a symptom of our adaptability that people can have the anxiety, but it also is really a strength that we have and demonstrates our adaptability, and to give those reprieves like Melanie's talking about, and acknowledge that this is a strength, that we are adaptable in other ways as well, and that there's sort of hope for breaking out of those cycles because our brain and our body was able to get into those cycles to begin with. We are changing organisms.
I think that's a great reminder for people who are in their habituated patterns. So that's almost, it's a reminder to them, and it may give them a little bit of hope, not false hope, but real hope that their body can change. It got into this pattern, it can change. People often feel hopeless about their anxiety and their depression as well, and just giving them a sense of hope, like you just described, I think is great.
I think that was a really great note to go out on. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Resilience Radio. We'll continue the conversation next week, discussing depression with the same panel. If you enjoyed this episode, you can like it on the podcatcher of your choice and share it with a friend, and of course, check it out next week. The music was brought to you by Aaron Marcus with their tune Some Biological Process. You can check the show notes for full credits on that. Until next time, take care.